Okay. Good morning, committee. Good morning, everybody in the public. We're going to deal with a couple of reports this morning. The first one was assigned to the auditor's office to hire a consultant to look into fraud and overpayment issues and perhaps more in the unemployment insurance system. We have the honor of having the deputy state auditor with us, Tim Ash, so he would like to introduce this topic. So I'll shut up now. Go ahead.
Honor might be a stretch. Tim Ash, for the record, Deputy State Auditor. Yeah, so I'm just going to be very brief and introduce Ian Gunn of Resultant and remind the committee that back when what became Act 51, which had a whole range of unemployment-related provisions, I think your committee had initiated a review of fraud and overpayment practices at the Department of Labor with an eye towards finding ways to improve that. You also wanted an independent entity to do the contracting process so that there'd be an arm's length remove, and that's why you selected the auditor's office. And I just want to be clear, in that spirit, we really viewed our role as soliciting bids, doing the contract process, and logistical support, and kind of facilitating things between the department, between Resultant, and between all the different stakeholders you had laid out. But we did not put an editorial fingerprints on this. We wanted the work to speak for itself, and the contacts and communications they had with various stakeholders to be unaffected by our office, just like you didn't want it to be affected by either the legislative or executive branch. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ian Gunn, and with one final thing, which is to say, I was able to observe that the Department of Labor was, from the beginning of this particular engagement, receptive and met with this group every single week for a few months. And I thought that was a very positive, just a positive thing. It made, I think, the work that they did a little bit easier, but also a reflection on the department's appreciation for the opportunities for improvement. So with that, I'll pass it off to Ian.
I just have one question. The solicitation process for bids and finding a consultant, was that a challenge, or was there a lot of bidders, or how did that work?
Just briefly, as you can imagine, many states were hiring firms to do effectively forensic audits of how much fraud had actually occurred. There's a handful or so who have now completed such audits. And there's not a ton of expertise in this field, particularly in unemployment. So we did a competitive bid, so the whole process worked the way it should have. One thing I'll mention, and this is just for future reference, the Department of Labor is a member of the National Association of State Workforce Organizations, or something like that, NASWA or NASWO. They also provide support to states for certain policy review and things like that. That would not have created the kind of independent view that you were looking for, because they view themselves as effectively having a member, which is the Department of Labor. So that's another resource for your work in general that you should also be thinking about, in the future.
Okay. So did you say, Ian, is that your first? We've met before, Ian.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us about the audit?
Will do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also other members of the committee. Just thank you for having us here today. Hopefully, time permitting, after the presentation, we'll have just a constructive dialogue at the end. Feel free to interrupt and ask questions as necessary. Like to thank Tim, the auditor's office. Also like to thank VDOL. They were very candid, and all the other stakeholders that we actually met. Everyone was incredible, incredibly open, incredibly honest, incredibly candid about their experience with unemployment insurance and unemployment insurance fraud. Note that throughout this presentation, I might use technical or industry jargon. If you need clarification, interrupt me, ask for more clarification. We'll dig into that. Also, we're going to refer to Vermont Department of Labor as VDOL. for whatever reason, that has become our sort of shorthand for the agency. Over the past 7 months, we, Resultant, per your request, reviewed their current state of fraud and improper payments. We think we have thoroughly detailed this within the report. What we're trying to do here today is really break that down and give you a brief introduction to that work, and try and bring forward the most meaningful and impactful things that you guys can take forward and do next. What we found, in fact, is modernization is likely the vehicle to bring all these parties together, who are both interested in stopping fraud and just collaboratively improving Vermont's UI system as a whole. And we'll hope through this presentation you'll get a sense of that. So next slide, please. So who are we? Just really briefly, we are an Indianapolis-based consulting firm. We have extensive work throughout state, federal, and local governments. And next slide. Most specifically, I think and relevant to this is our work with unemployment insurance agencies. We have a long history of both modernization and process redesign and assessments like this. Next slide. So brief project overview. The work we are presenting to you all today relates to Act 51 of 2021, which required someone. We were chosen to identify opportunities for VDOL to improve its efforts to prevent UI fraud and overpayments at the guidance of the Vermont State Auditor's Office. I think Tim kind of eloquently stated how they behaved in this, was really a facilitator in this. And I think it was invaluable to have them as a facilitation mechanism. Our statement of work required us to, one, examine VDOL's current fraud and overpayment detection and prevention methods, strike a balance between ensuring timely and accurate delivery of benefits while also mitigating payments and fraud, or improper payments and fraud, sorry. And three, evaluate UI penalties, including and up to criminal prosecution. Let's talk about what we did next. So next slide. In research and discovery, over the last months, we met with representatives of employers, such as the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility. We also met with claimant advocates, such as Vermont Legal Aid. We met with many of you and your colleagues in the House to discuss with them, and then several other state government entities. You can kind of see their icons on the picture, or on the screen there, who were invaluable to sort of giving us a broad perspective of the problem. Additionally, we also attended all of the unemployment insurance study committees. So we have a strong sense of the relationships at play here between both the Senate committees and the House committees and VDOL. Lastly, we thought it's important to just, as we placed in our report, we thought it prudent to present a very clear and consistent definition of improper payments so that we're all on the same page. This can be found on page 9 of the report. We thought it best to re-show it here. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably and can then create confusion. So just simply having this as a baseline for how we discuss and communicate about fraud will be really important going forward. Any questions here before I continue?
So yes, I have a question. This is a helpful chart. When you say ineligibility, that's really not fraud in common parlance. That's more like an overpayment that may be caused by a mistake or an inadvertent failure to understand something.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. These are common mistakes that can occur while filing claims. Sometimes it just happens through disagreements in facts that then become sorted out later in, let's say, an appeal. That can switch the original allowal of benefits to a denial of benefits, causing an overpayment. that is still technically, in the general sense, an improper payment, but is differentiated between that and fraud or prosecutable fraud by the fact that it was not willful or intentional on the part of the claimant.
So not to get ahead of ourselves here, is the report mostly on the latter two, or do you also get into recovery of overpayments that may have even been the department's fault?
We do actually briefly jump into overpayment collection methodologies and why that's important to the mitigation of fraud and improper payments. But it is not the main driver of the report. So.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Chair?
Yes, thank you, Senator Ram Hinsdale.
Thank you. Before moving over to fraud and prosecutable fraud, were you able to look at experiences of being deemed ineligible to understand demographic and other information that might be valuable? I was given a lot of information about people, particularly who don't speak English proficiently, and all this, then being deemed ineligible and having a lot of trouble getting access to an interpreter who could speak unemployment. And, I just hope in the future we're tracking that. And I don't know if you were able to track some of the demographics or experiences of people deemed ineligible.
Yeah, that's I think a really important place to continue the discussion. Sadly, I think what we found almost immediately while walking into the department and asking questions was that data of any sort is incredibly hard to come by. And it's to your point, very critical to the actual work that needs to happen here. And we did not enter, and it wasn't within our scope to do a deep data analysis. In our discussions with kind of most specifically the Vermont Legal Aid, we did hear a lot about that. We do think it's important. I think we'll sort of touch on that when we get to the conversation about some of our recommendations.
I appreciate that.
Yep.
Ian, if I may add to this discussion, Senator Hinsdale, we did connect with.
Would you just introduce yourself?
Yes, Senator. My name is Doran Moreland. I work alongside Ian from Resultant. We did connect with Miss Susanna Davis from the governor's office, and I was heartened to hear that there are efforts in the future to begin collecting those data, more demographic data. So I thought you might find it helpful to know that there is attention being put in that area.
Yeah, and I'm glad you put some attention and talked to Susanna or Director Davis as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doran.
Just technically, sorry, I'm just going to ask Scott, under the documents for today, could we be posting this report so that we can follow it on our devices so we can read that a little bit more clearly? Is that
Yes,
possible?
Senator. I'll take care of that.
Great, thank you.
Great. I'll proceed unless anybody has any objections. Caitlin, can you go to the next slide, please? So we'll start with just some high level current state findings. I think there's more in-depth information once you get into the report, but I think these are the high level elements. So the first step in improving systems is to evaluate their current state. We do that through research and discovery interviews. And through that, we learned that VDOL has taken critical steps to limit fraud, right? They have enhanced claimant security and improved the claimant experience as best they can currently. I think the more important steps are that we've authorized phase 1 of modernization. They've implemented an internal fraud unit and are growing that. And they've also decided to implement things like ID proofing. We also believe that they respond to fraudulent activity indicators. During the pandemic, they actually made an effort to take down the online application that is disruptive, but in combating fraud, it is an important element to be able to stop the fraud at the point it's occurring. And I think they just kind of migrated back to a prior state where they were taking claims over the phone, which definitely helps mitigate the avenues that fraud can be committed And so we thought that was actually an important point that we needed to hammer home, that these are things that they are showing to be very active in trying to do. So let's go to their limitations, though, because I think this is what everybody's really interested in, is how to get better. So despite all those things, they still have challenges. We all admit to that. I think they admit to that. This is likely not an exhaustive list of their limitations, but we think it's the most impactful from our research. And so first and foremost, they have a 40-year-old mainframe. You know this. We've tried to address that problem, or you all have tried to address that problem twice already. And as it relates to fraud prevention and detection, you will be hampered by not upgrading them. So it's just limiting your opportunities to make upgrades, both in fraud and other areas. We agree that with the other IT consultant that did a study on the mainframe and how to update it, that it likely should not be touched unless, critically necessary for maintaining normal operations.
Can I just ask a question
Sure.
on that? Before I think you said something, they've taken steps and been responsive in terms of like taking down the online application. Has anything happened in the last year or two where they did touch the mainframe to get at this fraud problem?
Not that we are aware of, and not that was presented to us throughout this. What we understood was turning off the online application. And I'll get to another point as we move to the data question around things that were attempted not within the mainframe, not to change the mainframe, but to extract the data from the mainframe. So
Okay.
Essentially, if I will just continue that thought, obviously accessing data is difficult. In fact, in the scope of this project, many conversations that we had asked questions about the scope of fraud. And we found it very difficult to answer that, being a firm that deals in data regularly, to not be able to dive into that deeply and understand what are the breadths, what are the specific actions, or the most what's the word I'm looking for? Most co-opted areas of fraud, the fraud vectors that people actually try to get in and attack the system. We don't know that simply because we did not do that quantitative data analysis. And so the lack of data really prevents that. It prevents us from performing new and novel cross matches that other states are performing with things like why are these things? PUPS, which is a prisoner update processing system, which maintains a national record of everyone who's currently incarcerated. These are just simple things that other states have actually walked the path, been able to do as they've migrated away from from their mainframe systems and actually modernized to more modern technologies. Last thing on this list, there is systemic challenges that have created distrust, such as application of fraud penalties and penalty weeks. I think we spoke to that earlier, where we explained that some people do things that are seemed or viewed by others as not a fraudulent act, but are punished by fraudulent penalties. I think there's a deep chasm between what we understand as fraudulent activity and the penalties that are applied, and that distrust that is created in the sort of the gap has really created a space for distrust in the application or in the process as a whole to seep in. So I think this one size fits all method is really the key there, that a penalty week system that isn't conducive to the variations and the shades of fraud that occur, both from like, I entered my information incorrectly for 1 week intentionally, versus unintentionally versus I defrauded many different personas or identities by filing fraudulent claims. That needs to be expanded, it needs to be more understood, and it needs to be clarified and punished with specific and accurate penalties. So let's jump into one other thing before we get into those larger recommendations, which is just kind of what we heard from everybody, or from the collective unit that we talked to regarding the desired future state. And I think it's probably just really easy to walk through these one by one. First, we want to enhance security for Vermonters' UI system without sacrificing individual access to beneficial government services. Next, increased accessibility to data for decision-making and process enhancement. Clear understanding of fraudulent actions and their consequences. I think I just mentioned that. And increased trust in VDOL's administration of the UI program in Vermont. So I think that's pretty clear. I think that was collectively what we'd heard from everyone as the true objective of any recommendations that we were going to set out. So no questions there, no comments, no disagreements. We'll move on to recommendations.
Can you go back for 1 second just to... I think this is an increased accessibility to data, but I think it's like operability and user experience. I mean, you can't get your tax forms until the following year online. Just like it just isn't very customer friendly, period, to use. And I don't necessarily see that in any of those points. But.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We definitely agree with the idea of user experience enhancements driving the ability for customers to understand at the bare minimum, and more importantly, like leverage and utilize and navigate government systems. I don't think our scope is, obviously, as we go beyond what our scope specifically asked for, there's a lot of things that are interconnected here. As you can appreciate, I'm sure that, yes, absolutely. I think that's boiled up in what will happen in their modernization, especially as they're doing claimant import portals. That being said, it's not really directly related or as directly related to our work in fraud and improper payment prevention. So we're a little more focused there. But yeah, you're right outside the bubble with your sort of suggestion there.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Yep. So moving to recommendations, we're going to start with this Gantt chart of sorts. We have this in the report on page 67. It's section 7 of the report. What we tried to do was take all of our recommendations, lay them into an actual timeline, and give some sense of when these activities could occur. Obviously, some are dependent on others. It's hard to do data cross-matching without having a data system or modernized systems in place. Those obviously will come later. We do have some intergovernmental collaboration there. That's sort of a broad catch-all term for collaborate collectively in the right human-centered way. That obviously should never end once you start it. It is a continuous process and it never really ends. But it's doesn't take a lot of investment. It's something easy that everybody can start doing and learning about. And we feel like you have a good placeholder for that in the CPO's office, which we find out about in the 11th hour of our discovery. I'll start with the top there, that yellow, that's all the activities that have currently been authorized.
Yeah, I'm going to have to interrupt you.
Sure.
We're already at 9:30.
Okay.
I could go on for another 10 or 15 minutes, but this is a colorful, detailed chart. If we go line by line, I just want to let you know that we have a hard stop at 9:45. Okay.
Excellent. I will rush through this and get through the last slides very quickly. So top authorized things that have already been allocated funds for. Those elements in green are really, as I'll expand upon later, are really supportive of that effort and ensuring that it kind of launches, is successful. There is a create a data environment down there in the recommended section. It is part of our formal first recommendations. Go do this now. It's unclear whether, allocated funds are there. Some of those other blue items in the middle there, really important, could start now, should start now. And then as we move down, obviously phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 of modernization, we put them on there so you can see the entire roadmap, but those are still a ways off. So I'll jump into the more detailed things if there's no specific questions there. So first, this body already took an important first step in authorizing $4.5 million to Vermont's UI modernization. We'd like to applaud that decision, support it, congratulate it, right? Italicize, bold it. Like, this is incredibly important. It will both improve customer communication, increase flexibility of UI UX for claimants, and enhance security. Those are the goals of that project. Those are critically important to stopping fraud as well, and critically important to making it possible for this body and the House and VDOL itself to making the necessary improvements to the process. I'd like to kind of highlight those necessary modernization support elements because I think they're critical and they're not kind of well understood. One, there are several IT industry best practices aimed at ensuring projects operate on budget and on schedule. First being good, strong project management. Alternatively, other major modernizations have taken the tact of looking to IV&V, or independent validation and verification. This is a third party that will come in and essentially call balls. Sorry, I think I lost my sound there for a second. We'll call the balls and strikes of a project, ensuring all project members are being supportive with one another. You might also go above and beyond that. There are other even more modern approaches that take IV&V plus, which takes IV&V and adds some elements to it that are important, or project assurance management, which kind of goes a similar route. And those really, IV&V is meant to be an independent, I just am reporting on what is occurring. IV&V plus and project assurance management go a step further by intervening when problems occur and helping to put the train back on the track to kind of make sure that it arrives at the station. So in interest of time, I'm going to kind of jump forward to the next slide. Unlocking your data is really important, critical to all the work you're about to go and do. It offers several kind of key advantages there. One, you can start doing the cross matches I was mentioning earlier. NASWA, Tim mentioned that in the intro, has an integrity data hub that has a large data cross match system. The agency is able to use it now on a one-by-one basis, but until it becomes automated or until they can do it en masse, it really is a more limited tool for them. And so to really enhance that ability, we're looking to unlock the data through an actual data environment outside of the mainframe system. It will likely join all the new data that is coming in from your claimant and employer portals, and then likely can pull out a lot of that data that is currently stored only within the mainframe, and you can start joining those things together. I think the last piece there is, like, everybody asked, what are the main causes of fraud? The answer is, at this point in time, not really sure. We don't know that because we didn't do the quantitative analysis. VDOL doesn't know that because everything they know is still fairly anecdotal. They don't have any concrete, here are the numbers laid out before us. This is a struggle for even the agencies that are modernized now to kind of ferret that out. It's very difficult and does take time. Likely will get more and more clear as kind of the backlog of fraud issues are resolved and investigations are resolved, and we have clear, definitive answers as to what was definitively fraud and what was just potentially fraud. And we rolled that back to just an improper payment or there is no fraud at all. So last thing, kind of sneak it in there right at the last moment, continuous improvement. I'll start by saying Resultant believes in human-centered design. We believe that it unlocks a lot of understanding that is critical. It has to be kind of tied to a process that allows people to continuously improve, though, as well. Otherwise, you stop you learn your first thing. So I think moving forward and where we really recommend this kind of body taking next steps in conjunction with VDOL and likely members of the House or other, there's many community members that would be beneficial to this cause, is work that we undertook to refine and help ferret out exactly where those breakpoints are from a consequence standpoint and aligning them with the actions that should be punished by those actions. I'll go in deeper there, which is we think you should jettison the penalty week system altogether and replace it with administrative penalties, which are more like fines. They're a bit more understandable for claimants. They're also easier to scale. So as you identify, here's a new breakpoint, it's easy to split. Oh, the penalty is now X for this action, Y for this action, and Z for this action. And those can be progressive in a way that's both accurate, equitable, and meaningful to the process of preventing or deterring fraud as well. I just jump to the last slide. I think this is probably, if I had to sum up everything that I was saying today, I think this is it. And really, it's something you likely already know.
Ian, can I jump in for a second? I was on mute, but just so I want to make sure the committee understands the basic principle involved, or the basic consequence involved with penalty weeks. They're very much more a severe penalty than, in most cases, than the fine itself, because not only with the fine, you can somehow pay it off and get eligible for benefits again, whereas with penalty weeks, you have to get rehired by somebody and get laid off under qualifying circumstances. So penalty weeks can become a real, if we're talking about the crime, the punishment fitting the crime, I think that's what Ian is trying to say.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Senator Sorokin. Yeah, absolutely. I think VDOL has also moved in that direction too. Really what we're recommending to build that out is more conversation with them. In some of the work we did to identify use cases that would help hold us all accountable to the specific use case that we're addressing, and build that universe of use cases and identified scenarios helps really identify what can we mitigate in this methodology and what can we not mitigate with this methodology. I think we obviously had spent more time elaborating on this in the report. You can read more about it there, but the conversation is really the important piece, and the walk through that process together is critical. Is there any other questions from the committee?
I just to summarize, because we're near the end of our time, I'm getting the sense of this is that we need a lot more information and data before we can make the proper policy changes. But we had some recommendations from the UI task force that are, I think, more geared towards the distinguishing the individual case of fraud, an individual case of fraud versus a negligent situation or an honest mistake. I'm glad this report is more focused on the systemic fraud and the bigger picture. But I'm guessing that the House will send us a bill dealing with some of these issues, because we did make some recommendations in the task force report. Do you have any, just to conclude, do you see, other than putting more money into the mainframe, into the mainframe situation, that legislatively you would recommend that we jump on right now?
So in the recommendation, you might have seen it on our timeline. There are a couple avenues that you could walk down. I think implementing policy without being able to take action from a system standpoint is difficult. It feels like doing things without an actual outcome, a meaningful outcome. That being said, there are likely some things that can be done today that would meaningfully take us forward. There were discussions that we were having late as we were tailoring our recommendations, as we were learning more about what's possible within Vermont. And one of them was just around this admin penalty idea. Does it require actual legislation? Potentially not. Could it be done by policy alone? Possibly. Should it be informed with the support of you? Absolutely. I think that's the best thing we can say right now. There are the report. One of the areas was wage garnishment. The other one was I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head on the report there. Wage garnishment was one. The other one was just simply the to your point, the financial support, the backing of the later modernization phases, and what additional elements might be needed to ensure that the first phase of modernization is completed, done well, done acceptably to your expectations. Those are the things that I think are most critical today. Legislatively, I think we don't have any other recommendations than what is in the report. Thanks. Senator Brock.
Senator Brock.
And I realize we have very, very little time to go into depth here, but on page 8 of your report, you make the distinction between fraud and criminal fraud or prosecutable fraud. On the basis of what's prosecutable fraud, were you able to find particular statutes that applied to unemployment fraud that reached a certain level?
Not in legislation. We spoke with the
Attorney General.
Attorney General's office. I kept thinking admin general, and I knew that was not right. Attorney General's office, and they fundamentally said, like, they are busy. Likely cases that came to them that were small, several weeks of unemployment insurance, likely wouldn't rise to the level of prosecution just through prosecutorial discretion. That being said, it isn't clear that they wouldn't take those cases either if they weren't busy. I think one of the other things that we heard early in our presentation was that Vermont as a whole has been attempting to decriminalize many of their statutes or many of their prosecution. And so the fact that we're looking at unemployment insurance fraud, we did also discuss, as we were kind of developing use cases, the types of fraud, right? Really, really intense fraud that occurs in a schemed way, where people are capturing several identities at a time, filing hundreds of claims rather than their one singular claim, and committing fraud that can actually take hundreds of thousands of dollars, are many times that are being committed by people that are not even within the jurisdiction of Vermont, right? These what we saw during the pandemic was people committing fraud from overseas, and that's not something that you're going to prosecute directly. And so being focused on that as a path forward until we have stronger data that says, Vermonters are committing fraud in this size or rate. Just didn't seem to rise to the level of a recommendable thing at this time.
So as a result, to the best of your knowledge, does Vermont have any statute that criminalizes any form of unemployment fraud?
We looked at it. I did not find anything that directly said commission of fraud will result in prosecution. Indirectly, though, some of the actions that are taken when committing unemployment insurance fraud are in your statutes, can be construed, I would say at best, but we did not formally identify the specific way that a prosecutor would have made that case.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to get to the bottom of that. I was muting myself out because I had the same question as Senator Brock. It sounds to me like under general fraud law, the AG in his discretion might be able to prosecute a serious offense, but there's nothing, as I understand it, or we repealed whatever was in there directly dealing with UI fraud. So does anybody else have any questions? I'd like to thank Ian and his team and Tim doing a very thorough job here. A difficult one without a lot of data to work with, but I think we're going to continue to talk about this. I understand we do have some limitations as to what we can do with due diligence, because it's hard to do due diligence without data. So, but we'll explore it further. And I want to thank you for your time. We have a bunch of other people waiting for a 9:30. So unless there's some questions with the commitment to revisit this, I think quite honestly, the House is going to send us something on this. So that's my understanding, and we'll probably take it up within that context.
Former
Deputy Auditor Ash.
Before we wrap, I did want to, because Senator Brock has been a key part of the Joint IT Committee. I do want to, one recommendation that stood out to me was the question of having independent sort of third-party analysis of the modernization IT project to make sure that it's achieving the objectives along the way. Something that I think the legislature has struggled with historically is how the legislature has kept its eyes to make sure some of these big ticket and important projects are successful. So one of the questions Senator Sorokin you raised was about how money factors into this. And I think one of the recommendations would cost some money, which is effectively having some version of Dan Smith, whether inside or outside of the legislative, operation, with a structured contract to be like a clerk of the works, if you will, on behalf of the legislature to keep tabs on that modernization phase 1 project.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. Legislature is usually underfunded in these things to keep another set of eyes on things. Okay, thank you all very much. We're going to move on. Goodbye, Tim. Goodbye, Ian. And
Bye. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We're going to move on we're going to start and pick this up after the break as well, but at least to get us started, we're going to hear from Mike Pichak on his oversight of the relocated worker consultants contract, and then he can, we'll see where the timing is before we continue on and when we take our break. But welcome, Mike. It's good to see you. Commissioner, welcome, Commissioner.
Well, nice to see you too, Chair Sorokin. So thank you very much to the committee for having us. We have a couple of members of the consulting team joining us as well. PFM Research was the consultant that we engaged with. Deanna and Stan are on. Thank them for being on as well. They did great work through the process and really appreciate the collaboration that we had. So I have a summary of the report, and I'm going to put up a presentation in a moment that I'll run through. Please feel free to interrupt me during it if you have questions. I'll ask Deanna and Stan to add anything that I might not have covered at the end. And then, of course, all of us are ready and willing for questions at the end as well. So let me share my screen.
Just before you start, I just wanted to share with the committee that we invited Auditor Hoffer to come and testify and give his concerns with the report, and he declined to testify. So.
Well, great. Well, thank you. And I can hit, I know, we, Auditor Hoffer is one of the stakeholders that PFM engaged with during this process. And I know some of the auditor's concerns, and their concerns that we highlight, not to speak for him, but they're concerns that we highlight in the report, or I wouldn't even call them concerns, I'd call them limitations, and we can get into that. And that's certainly covered both in our executive memo to the study, but also we'll cover it here today. So just, briefly, just to level set a couple of slides, what is the purpose of the worker relocation incentive programs? These are really programs that are designed to attract new employees, to help grow the state's workforce. Yes.
Are you putting up the presentation? I don't actually see it.
It's on our website, I believe. Yeah, Scott, it's under it's under something, but it could be posted under Michael's name for today under documents, what people go to. So Scott may have posted it already. It's posted, I know, in another section on our website, but I can't remember which one.
I think there was a button I forgot to hit, Senator Clarkson.
Yeah.
Can you see now?
Well done. I was watching it, having it on from our website. So it's in two places, which is great. Options for everything.
I've mastered Teams, but I have not mastered Zoom for sharing. So obviously, grow the state workforce, support Vermont employers, designed to help Vermont's demographic challenges that we're facing. Another new element that, certainly didn't exist in 2018 or 19, the fact that COVID-19 has really kind of split the need for people to work and live in the same geographic area. So a much larger portion of the national and regional workforce is now mobile, able to consider relocation to other areas. We'll get into that in a little bit. But the act, asked DFR to contract with an independent consultant to quantitatively, objectively study these reports, try to understand the return on investment, the impact that they're making. And that's what we did intend to do and hired PFM to do, and we'll run through the results of that. So again, just to level set, there are three programs at work here. There's the 2018 new remote worker grant program, the 2019 new worker relocation incentive program, and then a more recent 2021 program. So the 2021 program was too new for us to really be able to evaluate, or for PFM to be able to evaluate. So that is not part of this study. But we were able to evaluate both the 2018 and the 2019 studies, their programs, and that's what is included in the study. So we'll try to refer to them as the 2018 program and 2019 program to try to limit any confusion. But the 18 program was focused specifically on remote workers and getting remote workers to come to Vermont. The 2019 program had more of a focus on relocating workers who came to Vermont to become full-time Vermont residents and work for businesses here in Vermont. So those were the two different approaches. And you will see in the analysis that PFM did, there is a little bit of a difference in terms of the economic impact of those two programs, because one program is bringing an individual with a new job to the state. The other is bringing a new worker to an existing job in the state. So a little bit different impact in terms of the economic analysis. So PFM, conducted stakeholder interviews, a wide variety of folks in government, industry representatives, businesses. We also conducted a survey to determine the relative importance of these incentives to those grant recipients. Investigated and did some research about programs in other states, other municipalities, other regions, tried to gauge the effectiveness and the cost and the benefit of those programs. And then, as I mentioned, did an economic benefit modeling to try to, both determine the economic benefits and the direct tax revenue that was generated by the participants in the 2018 and 2019 programs. So just a couple of broad points here about the overall analysis. In the aggregate, the 18 and the 19 program, they totaled an appropriation less than $2 million. So when you're looking at broad economic or demographic metrics, it's really unlikely that any program with that amount of appropriation could have any measurable economic impact. So, we're not going to be able to look at broad economic measurements or broad demographic measurements to pick up any impact of this program. It's the impact is going to be more acute than that. So that's just sort of a broad statement. And then, of course, on the individual level, the grant amount itself, whether it's the full $10,000 for reimbursement or some lesser amount, is unlikely to be enough to motivate a person to move to Vermont solely. So both in the aggregate and in the individual level, the amount here, not enough to move the demographic or economic measurements in the aggregate. And on the individual level, not sufficient to be the sole motivating reason to get someone to move to Vermont. Most grant recipients mentioned a number of other factors for why they consider moving to Vermont. Outdoor recreation opportunities, the reputation of Vermont as a safe place to live and raise a family. But at the same time, the survey respondents also indicated that the grants were an important reason in terms of the influence of their overall decision to relocate to Vermont. So the grant programs, although not the sole reason, it did appear for a large number of respondents to be an important and influential reason that factored into their decision to move to Vermont. So these are the survey results from the report, just to give you a flavor of what the survey respondents said. They surveyed about just over 200 people. I think Deanna said yesterday we got about 89 or 90 responses. So pretty good result in terms of the number of respondents here. We asked them to do it voluntarily. They had no obligation to do so. But you can see the top two, access to outdoors recreation, safe place to live and raise a family, access to community cultural amenities. Many had an existing connection to Vermont. That existing connection to Vermont, the dominant connection was previously vacationing in Vermont. There were also folks that had gone to school in Vermont, that grew up in Vermont and moved back, or had family members in Vermont. And then you see the grant incentive to relocate. So 52% of respondents said that it was a significant factor influencing the relocation decision. So to try to sort of determine what that means in terms of economic impact, it would be, unfair to assume that all of those individuals that moved did so solely because of the grant program, that they would not have moved here but for the grant program, as we mentioned before. But at the same time, important to measure sort of what that maximum direct economic impact could be if we did accredit these programs to the creation of all of the new household and associated new household income with Vermont. So PFM first did that, looked at the maximum direct economic impact of all of the participants in the program, then looked at the minimum economic direct impact that could be associated. So basically the actual costs of paying movers, paying furniture companies, fitting out your office, and those type of direct. And those are really sort of the guardrails or the universe in terms of what could be the economic impact. Way on the minimum side, it's basically just the appropriation amount being moved out into the Vermont economy. On the maximum side, it's that plus all of the household income that's associated with people's advantage of these grant programs. So the truth really lies somewhere in, and really the question is, how do you get at that middle ground? So what PFM did in their analysis, is, obviously looking at the minimum, like we mentioned, the maximum, but then also incorporated the survey data and discounted the maximum by about 50% to try to get at, how many of those individuals, were influenced significantly by the grant program in terms of their movement to Vermont. So you can see on the minimum side, 3 jobs, $200,000 in wages, $500,000 in economic impact. So, that's a $500,000 appropriation going out into the economy and creating $500,000 in annual economic impact. At the maximum, when you factor in all of the household spending, they estimate 110 new jobs, 5.2 million in wages, and 16.2 million in annual economic impact. So again, those are the guardrails. When you put this sort of 50% discount approach, that gets you to this, reasonable estimate, in our opinion at DFR, reasonable estimate of 52 new jobs, 2.5 million in wages, and 7.6 million in economic impact. So another way of thinking about that is for every tax dollar that was spent on the 2018 program, it resulted in approximately $94 in economic impact. So a big amount of leverage there in terms of the dollar spent and the economic impact that was derived.
Commissioner, can
And
I
then-
ask you a second?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit what the term economic impact means?
Yeah, so, and I'll let Stan mention this if he can go into more depth, but the way I understand PFM looked at this was total household income. They discounted, some factors in terms of monies that wouldn't be spent in the Vermont economy, but then looked at what the overall total household income would be and what that money did when spent in the Vermont economy.
So it's so it's a new person coming to Vermont and multiplying it by their spending patterns, and then there's some sort of multiplier effect that economists put on that, and that equates to economic impact.
Yes, that's correct.
And how does that translate into ultimately tax revenue for the state? Is that a whole different calculation, or you take that economic impact and you multiply it further or something?
So Implan will tell us, Implan is the software program that we use to calculate the economic impacts. And Implan will tell us what the total economic activity is, which consists of the direct spending, which is the household income, and then the indirect and induced spending, which is the multiplier effect that you referred to. And they also calculate the tax impacts at the state level, the federal level, and the local level. So we were able to capture from a different set of calculations from Implan the value of the state taxes that were generated as well. And I think Michael has that in his following slides.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Stan. Thank you for that explanation. So as Stan said, their analysis captures the state tax revenue estimates, and you can see that there on the first line, $419,000 in annual state tax revenue is the estimate. And just a reminder, the program itself cost $500,000. So an estimate of 84% of the total direct costs generated in new state tax revenue in 1 year. So PFM determined that the program would pay for itself within 2 years of implementation on the 2018 program side. On the 2019 program, a very similar analysis, that minimum, that maximum. You can see similar impacts on both the minimum and the maximum. And then when you apply this 50% approach, you can see the 63 new jobs, the 3.1 million in wages, and the 9.5 million in economic impact. So for this program, every dollar spent resulted in approximately $66 in economic activity. Again, the other program was $94 per dollar. This was $66 per dollar. The difference, and Stan can go into this more, but the difference being, you're bringing a totally new job to Vermont in the 2018 program versus the 2019 program, bringing an individual to the state for a job that already exists. So it's a job that would be filled hopefully one way or the other. And then the direct tax revenue for the 2019 program, $527,000 in annual state tax revenue. So this program appropriated about $670,000. So similar to the 18 program, a large chunk, about 80% of direct costs are coming back to the state in 1 year. And again, PFM determined and estimated that the program would pay for itself within 2 years. So these are the overall, this is the overall summary of the financial impacts. Just to level set on how many studies there have been looking at programs like this. You know, this study is basically the second one in the country. The only other study that exists is the study that was looking at the Tulsa program in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So in the Tulsa study, they looked basically at the maximum economic impact, and that was the measurement that they used. So, you know, I think this is a much more reasonable approach coming at it with a discounted rate of 50% based on the survey data. I think it ties it much more into people's actual decision making. And the point that we made in our memo, and that I'll make again here, is, you know, maybe the 50% estimate is on the high end of that, of the possible range. But even if you discount it by another 50%, there is still significant economic impact that's derived from the programs. And maybe instead of 2 years of them paying for themselves, it would take 3 years, but the programs still generate ongoing revenue that would cover those initial appropriation costs. And just a note on the ongoing annual state tax revenue. You know, some people will obviously leave the program over time, or leave Vermont, I should say, over time. Others might get, you know, salary raises or advance in their careers in ways that increase revenue to the state. So those numbers aren't stagnant, but, you know, those would be the sort of the approximate year over year annual state tax revenues if they stayed constant in the program.
Senator Clarkson.
Yeah, Michael and Stan. Stan, you didn't fully introduce yourself, but hi, it's great to have you. You know, it just strikes me that we have an opportunity and this terrific work to actually keep studying, do a longitudinal study of this kind of a program over time so that we can track, you know, Michael, you just referring to, you know, if they stay in their job, if they don't. It would be fabulous if we as a state had an ability to track our new programs, you know, over, let's say we gave ourselves 10 or 15 years to do this, but it would really be great to track them over time so that we know how effective they are over time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Senator. I mean, if you're not measuring the program, you're not collecting data for the program that you can then measure it. You really just have no idea whether it's successful or not, other than anecdotes or maybe
right. And we sadly spend too much of our time in the legislature making decisions on anecdotes. And it would be, you know, this is an opportunity for us at this moment to continue collecting this data and be able to do reports on it on a regular basis and measure it over time.
Yeah, I would like to just pick up on that. I'm a big fan of, you know, when you give out money to people, that there can be some strings attached. Now, I don't know that you go so far as to have them sign something that say they'll be available to the administrators of this program to provide information on their lives going forward. But if it's not done already, I think, you know, one idea for this program would be to at least have something in the material that it would be very beneficial to the state. And, you know, at this point, would the person be willing to generally understand or commit to being available to the state to provide information? It's not a heavy lift for someone to sign that, but, you know, just if they know that someone might call them in a year, and it would help the state to know what's going on, and they may be more forthcoming with the information. That's a general statement. I did have a specific question. I don't know whether I should wait for standard enough. Where does property taxes fit into local property? Were they included here in terms of economic tax revenue that comes to the state?
One assumes.
For
Well,
the,
it says state tax revenue.
yeah, for the taxes that are paid that go to the state, they're included. Most of the ad valorem taxes are collected at the local level, at the county level or the city level. We did have a, let's see.
Well,
There are some property taxes that are collected that do remit back to the state, and
Yep.
those are included in those 419,000 and 527,000. It mainly includes sales tax, the portions of property tax that come back in, motor vehicle licenses, corporate profit tax, personal income tax, and other personal taxes.
Okay. And the other question I have from what I've heard so far is the assumption made that if somebody comes through the 2019 relocated worker program, it's not necessarily creating a new job, or I guess maybe some of things like property taxes are not increased because the person's moving into the house of the person who is leaving his or her job. It's really nuanced, but it seems to me that a lot of people could be retiring, staying in Vermont, staying in their home, and this new person coming here is buying a newly constructed home, or so I'm wondering why you just delete the fact in all those cases that there's no added gain there, and that it's just replacing another worker.
Well, I think you're right. It's not perfect. I think what this does do is give us the basics of it, but it doesn't give each of the individual cases and the net ins and outs that are associated with it. The outs, the outflow, the people that may be leaving a house or leaving a job, the program really doesn't influence that. The program only influences the people that are coming in. So in trying to capture just the effects of the program, you might not want to count the people that are leaving, understanding, it's pretty, as you say, it's pretty nuanced, and it's a net effect. You could assign those differences, those net differences, to companies or to other programs, or not at all.
I guess all I was saying is that seems like fairly conservative approach, especially in this COVID environment where we have such job shortages that it's just coming in, and another person, when they come in, someone's leaving. And it seems like that's the assumption here. And it could be that, we need this worker here, and it adds a new worker to the state without somebody leaving that business. So it's just to consider.
And to tag on to that, Mr. Chair, it enables that business possibly to stay in business, right, which is an added value that is hard to measure. But, one of the reasons we're bringing people in from out of state is we aren't necessarily able to find that person that's the right person for that job. If that enables that business to grow and flourish, can we count that growth and flourish to the impact of that piece of expertise or that worker coming in?
Okay. I'm at fault for extending us here, but let's finish up the mic, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back to Stan.
So mentioning and Senator, you picked up on one of the limitations, but just mentioning the limitations of the report, and this has nothing to do with this report or PFM. It just has to do with programs quantitatively measuring programs like this. So it's difficult to quantify exactly how many participants in these programs would have relocated to Vermont without the incentives. In the same way that there's the minimum and the maximum economic impact, you could say everyone would have moved to Vermont if these programs didn't exist. You could say no one would have moved to Vermont if these programs didn't exist. And again, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So how do you reasonably measure that is what PFM strive to do here. The Tulsa study that I mentioned, which is the only other study that looks at these kind of programs, acknowledge the same thing, that there's no way to quantitatively and 100% identify who would have moved to Tulsa or to Vermont, and that's sort of the basis of how do you determine the economic impact. So again, PFM, a much more reasonable approach in terms of discounting that maximum impact to try to get at a reasonable estimate of the economic benefit. And then, as Senator Sorokin said, there's sort of this micro level challenge of trying to determine, who is specifically moving to the state, who might be leaving the state, as somebody might be selling their home with a higher income and moving out of the state, and someone comes in through the program, buys the home and has a lower income. It might have a net loss to the state. It might work the other way too. It might be a higher income earner coming in, or it might be someone coming in that has particular job skills that benefits the state. It's just really impossible to measure that at that micro level. So it's just another limitation on the report that we want to call out. So I do want to give Deanna a chance to speak here. So I will sort of leave the recommendations part to her, but they came up with a series of recommendations here. One, just to address, it's outside of the report, is the fact that when people are moving, and we've seen that a lot of people, because of the pandemic, are moving, they're moving from more urban, less affordable areas, trying to find more affordable areas. So this ability to make Vermont, as affordable as possible through affordable housing, reliable, accessible, affordable childcare, and then access to high-speed internet are some key factors that are no surprise to this committee that PFM identified. And pages 25 through 32 in their report sort of benchmark Vermont to some peer states, trying to look at how we measure up in some of these sort of factors that are important for people in terms of their possible relocation, separate from the grant program. And then again, just one last point here. Although, Vermont was first in developing the 2018 program, by our count, at least 52 other municipalities or states have followed suit. So at this point, there is quite a bit of competition for individuals or employees who are considering moving to a new location. So it's quite possible that, a jurisdiction that does not have a similar program, will be viewed as less competitive to these employees that are willing to move. So anticipate that more municipalities and states will develop programs like this over the years. But just another point that it's much more competitive landscape now than it was in 2018 or 2019. So Deanna, do you want to?
We're gonna take a break now, but I just want to say two things. Early on, you said something about how the $5,000 or $10,000 may make not enough difference. When this committee started with this bill, the incentive was $200. So, yeah. The second thing I think is really important to say. I mean, this is all kind of hard to quantify. I think everybody readily admits that. We also readily admit that it was not likely to be the sole factor in making people move. And it's just like the but-for test in veggie and other places. It's hard to quantify that as well. But one of the things that I think, as long as there's not every state in the country has one of these, one of the big things that's really hard to quantify is the attention this brought to the state of Vermont. And even if people didn't apply or qualify the program, they started to explore the state of Vermont as a place to live. And some of those people aren't included in your numbers at all. And that could be even bigger than the numbers that are included in your report. So let's take a break till 10:30, and we'll come back and hear from the consultants. Thank you.